of all, thank you so much for inviting us to present at this really wonderful conference. I will be presenting work that I've been doing with Julia Cajal-Grossi at the Graduate Institute, who I think is following us online, and then with a variety of other co-authors. The paper we submitted is with Davide, but as I'll explain in a minute, I'll actually kind of give you a progress reports on a few different things we are trying to do. So let me skip the motivation. Supply chain disruption have become very popular. So what we are trying to do in this set of work is to understand how buyers' sourcing strategies, so how large buyers approach sourcing, mediate the response to supply chain disruptions. And by sourcing strategy, we understand the fairly complex bundles of interrelated decisions, which include who do you source from, where do you source from, which kind of volumes, how much do you pay, the frequency, the timing, and also which kind of relationships do you have with your suppliers. Now, from the point of view of understanding the response to supply chain disruption, we are going to focus in this talk on two dimensions of these bundles. The first one is what we call relationality, that is the extent to which the buyer relies on long-term relationships with few core suppliers to procure their inputs. And the second one is just in time, that is the extent to which goods are received from supplier only as they are needed. The reason we focus on these two particular dimensions is because theory suggests that the adoption of these two dimensions should be complementary. They are complementary practices in the bundle, and yet they might have opposing implications under supply chain disruption, that is in the ways in which the buyer with these different aspects of the bundle responds to the shock. So why is it that I say that they are complementary practices? There's a very nice paper sort of formalizing sourcing strategy, sourcing systems by Taylor and Wiggins in the AR as a bundle of different dimensions. And one thing that paper emphasizes is that dynamic incentives that is what you get essentially if you rely on long-term relationships. So if you are relational, if you like, are more effective at providing incentive for just-in-time, that is small and frequent orders. And so that's the theoretical reason for why we expect these two dimensions to tend to come together if we were to look at them across different buyers. At the same time, there is some work that has shown that while a long-term relationship can buy more resilience in the sense that when there is a shock, maybe the suppliers will tend to prioritize buyers with whom they have a very long-term relationship and that therefore are very valuable. It is also the case that these buyers, precisely because there is a relationship in place, they might be providing some slack to the supplier in order to accommodate to the supply conditions. While in contrast, we might expect that, and there is some recent work that has looked into that firms that adopt just-in-time might essentially need to force their suppliers to deliver no matter what, precisely because the buyers that relies on just-in-time doesn't really have a lot of slack in terms of inventories. So we're going to try to look a little bit at this hypothesis in the context of the garment sector. And as I mentioned, I'll tell you about different findings that with Julia we have found in different papers. When Julia and I started working on the garment sector, now maybe more than 10 years ago, this was a sector of intrinsic interest to us because it's a very important sector for producing countries. It's a sector that generates a lot of poverty reduction and probably kickstarts industrialization. But also, now it turns out after working for a long time in this sector, we also have some fairly unique data that might allow us to shed some evidence on these questions. And essentially the rest of the talk is going to unfold into step. In the first part, I'm going to try to share with you the way we have been trying to measure sourcing strategies in the data. Our dream with Julia would have been to be able to run a survey of large international buyers of garments or in other sectors. This we have attempted several times. It proves very difficult. It's not easy to sit down with many, chief procurement officers of a very large corporation to discuss exactly how they source stuff. If you know ways of doing it, please do get in touch. We are still interested. And so what we're going to do in that first part is put forward a couple of different indexes of relationality and just-in-time that can be computed from readily available or fairly readily available nowadays customs data set. And then in the second part, I will basically follow on the keynote from Pat and try really to provide an anatomy of the short-term response to the COVID shocks in Bangladesh, okay? And there we're gonna rely on a combination of, it's going to be joint work with Laura Boudreau at Columbia Business School, and we're gonna rely, this is much more preliminary work, and we're gonna rely on a combination of these customs records alongside a survey that was implemented during the COVID shock of exporters, in which we asked a lot of very detailed questions were asked about how the buyers coped with the shock. All right, so the first step, therefore, is to measure relationality. The management literature tell us, look, fundamentally, there are two different bundles of sourcing strategy. You can think spot buyers or the American style procurement system, buyer allocate short-term orders to the lowest bidders, keeping suppliers at arm's length. And then, in that type of system, what you expect to see is that, the suppliers rotate very frequently, and therefore purchases are spread among multiple suppliers. While in what is often called the Japanese or relational system, buyer tends to allocate orders to a few core suppliers with whom they develop long-term relationship, precisely to incentivize behavior that is otherwise difficult to contract upon. And so this very simple observation to us suggested a measure of how relational is a buyer, which is essentially a weighted average across product and countries of origin of how many suppliers does the buyer use or source from relative to the aggregate volume of shipments that the buyer has. And when you implemented this measure in the garment sector, you get something like this. From originally, this is taken from the original paper, so using the Bangladeshi data. What you see there is that, for instance, take two buyers like Levi Strauss and JCPenney. They have a very similar market share, by which we mean that they source a similar volume of garments, but in a typical year, they use a very different numbers of suppliers. So JCPenney uses about 26 different suppliers, while Levi Strauss only uses about 8 suppliers. And turns out that if you read a little bit the industry publication, it's definitely the case that Levi Strauss is considered one of the most relational buyers in the industry. It's a company that has always had the strategy of dealing with few highly selected suppliers and investing a lot in this relationship. JCPenney is more of a kind of a cost-cutting type of strategy where essentially they chase the cheapest. And so this gives you an intuition for this measure. And what we have found in previous work is a couple of interesting facts. The first one is that now, armed with this measure of how relational a buyer is, we can check what explains how relational a particular buyer is when sourcing from country A in product J. And much to our surprise, we found in a variance decomposition exercise that the buyer fixed effect explained the vast majority of the observed variation in sourcing strategies. In other words, H&M is a relational buyer, tends to be more relational than JCPenney, regardless of whether they are sourcing women's shirts from Vietnam or men's trousers from Bangladesh. And this to us is interesting because it points to the idea that probably our firm level capabilities, if you like, the way the management people would describe it, saying that are important drivers of how things are sourced, as opposed to transaction costs that are more intimately connected with essentially the market and type of product that you're sourcing. The second fact that we documented in the Bangladesh paper was that in that context, we were able, thanks to a fortuitous combination of data, to measure, to have a very good proxy of the margins that the exporters from Bangladesh earns on different export orders. And essentially, this is simply an illustration. What we find is that a given exporter earns higher margins when they deliver very similar export orders to relational buyers, okay? So relational buyers and non-relational buyers, they don't seem to differ, at least within exporters, in terms of the cost and the type of product that they source. Condition on the same type of, condition on the same product and orders that look otherwise very similar, they pay a higher price and therefore they leave on the table higher margins for the supplier. So why this is an intriguing fact? So, why is it that these guys pay, these relational buyers pay higher prices? There are various different reasons. one reason suggested by theory is that relational incentives are used in tandem with just-in-time. So essentially, you pay a little bit of a price premium in order to guarantee yourself this frequent delivery of smaller orders that are very regular and allow you to optimize on the inventory management. So in the second paper, this is joined instead with Davide Del Prete, we went out and tried to measure the adoption of just-in-time practices across buyers in this industry. Here, the metrics, so we use data essentially from a variety of different countries, a little bit as we did before. And here, the idea of the metrics is, again, is going to be a weighted average of some proxy for just-in-time across, weighted average across product, season, destination markets, and so forth, of what? Of essentially what's the average turnover of products of that buyer relative to the average turnover in that particular segment. And by turnover, we mean essentially what's the average delays or interval in between days, measured in terms of times, of orders or transactions received by the buyer for that particular segment, which we define as being a origin, destination, season product category. Okay, and of course we normalize that delays relative to the overall volume of sourcing of the buyer. And so here the idea is really basically to say, well, look, if I see a buyer that imports very frequently relative to their overall size and relative to what is customary done in that particular segment, that buyer probably is more likely to have adopted the just-in-time type of sourcing practices than not. So in terms of measurement, here is a very similar table, just with more buyers, but let me maybe match out. The first thing that we document is that very much consistent with the theory, across buyers, this is for the top 500 garment buyers in our data set, the adoption of these two practices are very strongly correlated. So if you do just-in-time, relational buyers tend to do just-in-time. But then we document in the paper with Davide a bunch of other things which are interesting, very much like relationality. Just-in-times is also mostly explained by buyer fixed effect as opposed to product or destination or origin characteristics. The size of the buyer positively correlate with both relationality and just-in-time, and the correlation I showed you before is conditional on size. And that's consistent again with economies of scale associated with setting up this sort of Japanese-style procurement system. Interestingly, we find that buyers that are more diversified in terms of destination markets, they tend to be more relational and to adopt more just-in-time. We don't know exactly why that's the case, but one conjecture is that the downstream diversification allows the buyer to smooth out demand and guarantee more stable orders. And then one thing that I haven't listed here, but that ties back to the question I asked before to Alejandro on his paper with Jean and Hanan, is that we also find that relationality negatively correlates with the diversification in terms of the origins that the buyer source from. So it looks like it might be that the strategy of investing in very strong relationship with a few core suppliers, sort of, it might be a substitute to the alternative strategy, which is to say, well, I'm going to try to cope with shocks, but essentially having a very diversified supply base. All right. So these were our kind of attempt in sort of papers that are already out there to sort of make some progress in terms of the measurement of these supply chain strategies in a particular context. But we think that these proxies can, of course, be utilized in other sectors as well. Now, in the second part of my talk, I'm gonna try to, I will describe some very, very preliminary work that we are doing with Laura Boudreau on questions which we think are very related. So in reality, the project we are working on with Laura is a project on understanding how buyer sourcing strategies relate to working conditions in garments. As part of that project, there's many moving parts in that project, but as part of that project, we have kind of tried to explore an anatomy of how buyers with different sourcing strategies behaved during a particular supply chain disruption, which was the onset of the COVID pandemic in March, April, and May of 2020 in Bangladesh. Okay, this I should stress is very, very preliminary work. So when COVID appeared, the main issue that was a concern for industries in garments was, well, COVID is happening in the destination markets. There's going to be lockdowns. all these large buyers shut down shops, and therefore they start canceling orders from their suppliers, okay? And this was a very big issue for the suppliers in the emerging economies, because all of a sudden your buyers, to whom you're already maybe producing, 60,000 t-shirts, say, you know what, I actually don't need these t-shirts anymore. And so what we're gonna do, as I mentioned, look at this detailed anatomy, and we're gonna kind of exploit a couple of data sets, very detailed customs records, as well as this original firm level survey, which has a module on the COVID impact on the firm, and then tailor-made modules on buyer responses and working conditions. We have other data for the working condition part, but let me skip that. So this is just descriptive. If you plot the volumes of exports to particular buyers, you see actually that in the data, you see a large drops in orders, exporters to the buyers when there is the COVID onset. And this drop is larger for buyers that are relational. So here we distinguish 4 types of buyer. We create essentially a dummy for whether the just-in-time or the relational dummy in the global customs record is high. And therefore, we have buyers that are neither relational nor just-in-time. We have buyers that are only just-in-time. And then we have buyers that are only relational or that do both. There are relatively few buyers that are only relational, that is, are relational but not just-in-time in this classification. But as you can see, somewhat, to our surprise, the drop in export volume is actually larger for relational buyers than for the other type of buyers. When we go to the survey, we find that indeed across, so we ask, very detailed question, we're asked to the exporters about how did this buyer with whom you had orders behave, okay? And it looks like there was a lot of renegotiation of these orders. We'll go back to it in a second. But when it comes to order cancellation, it's relational buyers that really canceled the orders. So in other words, what the survey tells us is something that is very consistent with what we have seen in the customs. However, when we understand the type of negotiation that was going on with this buyer, we find an interpretation of this higher reduction in orders that is quite different from what we would gain from simply considering the customs data. And in particular, relational buyers were significantly more likely to pay for material for orders that were canceled, but for essentially for cost that the supplier had already incurred. The main material, of course, is fabric here. They were also much more likely to still pay for labor that had already worked on the production order, even though the order was canceled. And then, they gave additional concessions in the forms of, particularly delays, maybe quality defects and so forth. So in other words, what the survey is telling us is that larger drop in export volume associated with these relational buyers reflect negotiated support, not a pulling out at the time of crisis. So at the time in which the buyer doesn't maybe needs less of the product, they kind of negotiate this type of adjustment to the demand shock with their suppliers. And if that's the case, we expect the relational buyers to take a much softer stand on delivery delays as well as prices relative to only just-in-time buyers. And then potentially, this was an adjustment that had been negotiated, we should see that in the long term, the relationship with this relational buyer fare better than with just-in-time buyers. We do find confirmation for both of these hypotheses. So it turns out that in these particular customs records, you can link the imports of fabric that is used on a particular order to the export date. And therefore, we can construct proxies or measures of the lead time or the duration of an order, okay? So think about, lead time is really kind of our preferred one, is a measure of essentially delays it ends up being, because you see when the fabric has arrived, and then you see when the export order goes out. And as you can see, indeed, relational buyers essentially accept the orders that they still receive, so they receive fewer orders, and conditional receiving orders, they essentially accept much longer delays, both in terms of duration and lead time, than the just-in-time buyers. When it comes to prices, it looks like the just-in-time buyers actually, if anything, conditional receiving an order, they paid lower prices than instead what the relational buyers did. It's unclear whether the relational buyers paid a little bit higher prices or not. I would make two remarks. One is we need to do more work because, given that they canceled many more orders, there's a selection on the orders that are still delivered. And then the second thing is that theory of kind of repeated transaction tells us that it's not obvious that you need to use prices to provide any kind of incentive, since you can rely on the future value of the relationship, and then if parties are risk neutral, the two are kind of perfect substitute. But we do definitely see instead that it seems that these just-in-time buyers, they kind of take a tougher stance. You say, well, we really want to get the orders. There's going to be delays. We're going to pay you a little bit less. And so indeed, when we look at the future value of a relationship, we have a couple of different proxies, one from a survey and then the other from the customs record. We see that in the long term, relationship with relational buyers fares much better. So in particular, the firm, we ask whether the way the buyer behaved during the crisis affected their perception of the value of the relationship with the buyer. And so 0 here would be that it would say, well, it hasn't neither improved nor decreased, and then it was a positive number, means that the perception of the buyer in the eye of the exporter has improved. And although the estimates are noisy from the survey, there's definitely some evidence that the relational buyers have now a better perception, are better perceived by the exporters, despite having canceled more orders. And then when we look 1 year and a half later in the record, in the data, we see that relational buyers are much more likely to still be trading with the same suppliers. Okay, so this is the percentage of relationship essentially that died, within a year. Where are we taking this evidence? So let me just mention the reason why we were, remember, this is part of a broader project on working condition. Here we are maybe asking a lot from the data, but there is some evidence that perhaps because of the support that the relational buyers negotiated with their suppliers, there is some evidence that the factories in Bangladesh at the time of COVID essentially fired fewer workers. The factories that mostly supply relational buyers essentially fired fewer workers than the other factories. In other words, the stability that comes from the relationship translates then to higher job stability for the workers. And in future work, we plan to exploit this very detailed worker level data that we have from that context. And we do find some evidence that the fact that you don't lose the job, even temporary, of course, in a context in which there is very limited social protection, actually has long-term consequences for the workers. The other next steps that we are still exploring, very much like in the earlier paper, in the context of Bangladesh, we can have this proxy for the margins that the suppliers earn from the Bangladeshi, from the foreign buyers, and so we will definitely try to explore how markups essentially and how margin changed during the crisis, but we haven't got there yet. All right, so let me maybe wrap up. So I presented results from an ongoing agenda to understand sourcing strategies in garments. On the measurement front, we introduced a couple of different indexes to measure relationality and just-in-time. We think that these can be applied in many other contexts, and they are fairly well validated in our context. I didn't have time to explain that. We then show you 3 facts. The first is that relationality and just-in-times are positively correlated, consistent with the theory and perhaps with the previous evidence, in the sense of evidence that pointed at this as a potential channel. Relationality and just-in-times are mostly explained by buyer rather than market product effects, which to us suggests that the adoption of this different sourcing system should really be understood from the lens of the capabilities of the firm, as opposed to kind of transaction cost theories that is kind of adjusting the way you buy stuff to the transaction complexity in a particular context or product. And then finally, we provided preliminary evidence that indeed these two complementary bundles, complementary dimension of the bundle, might actually have radically different implications when it comes to response to shocks. Okay, and I want to point out here that the combination of the survey data and the custom records is really critical, I think, to get the right interpretation. With only the customs record, I think we would have walked away with a very different interpretation of the evidence. I think there's a lot more work to be done. Again, we worked on garments for reasons that are sort of tangential to supply chain disruption. With unlimited bandwidth, I'd like to see similar work done in sectors that are maybe more important from the point of view of resilience and critical sector. We will certainly look in the context of garments at other shocks. And then I think that the very important thing that remains to be done, maybe building from this type of micro evidence, but combined with the sort of theories that we have seen before, is to understand the extent to which the decentralized choices of sourcing strategy are socially efficient. Okay, we have some perception that there might be an underinvestment from a social point of view in long-term relationships, but this is really nothing more than a conjecture at this point. Thank you so much, and yeah, let me stop here.